Welcome once again to the official MUFON podcast. I'm your host, Richard Beckwith. Preston Dennett began investigating UFOs and the paranormal in 1986 when he discovered that his family, friends, and co-workers were having dramatic, unexplained encounters. Since then, he has interviewed hundreds of witnesses and investigated a wide variety of paranormal phenomena. He is a field investigator for the Mutual UFO Network, a ghost hunter, a paranormal researcher, and the author of 28 books and more than 100 articles on UFOs and the paranormal. Several of his books have been Amazon UFO bestsellers. His articles have appeared in numerous magazines including Fate, Atlantis Rising, the MUFON UFO Journal, Nexus, Paranormal Magazine, UFO Magazine, Phenomena Magazine, Mysteries Magazine, Ufologist, and others. His writing has been translated into several different languages, including German, French, Portuguese, Russian, and Icelandic. He has appeared on numerous radio and television programs, including Midnight in the Desert with Art Bell, Coast to Coast, and also the History Channel's Deep Sea UFOs and UFO Hunters. His research has been presented in the LA Times, the LA Daily News, the Dallas Morning News, and other newspapers. He has taught classes on various paranormal subjects and lectures across the United States. He currently resides in Southern California, but we have him here tonight as our guest. Preston Dennett, welcome to the MUFON podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
I really appreciate you being here. And I know you're busy because you've got a lot of things going on. You've written, you're a prolific author. You've written 28 books on the UFO subject, and I have to wonder why.
I kind of wonder that myself, actually. Honestly, yeah, this was never something I was really looking for, and actually came into this field very skeptical, profoundly skeptical. I knew my brother had said he'd seen a UFO, but I did not want to hear about it. It wasn't until 1986. I was actually a pretty young man. That made me 21 years old, and really skeptical of UFOs. Then a report came on the news. I remember this vividly, November 17, 1986. And there was a sighting over Alaska, apparently. And this is a very well-known sighting. I'm sure you've heard of it. Captain Kenju Toroshi.
Yes.
Sighted. Yeah, it's a great case. Radar returns.
Wonderful case.
They didn't really cover that on the news, I can tell you that. They just kind of joked about it, laughed nervously, and moved on. But they did show the captain and mentioned the sighting. I thought, wow, this poor captain thought he saw a UFO. He's clearly misperceiving, lying. I just did not believe he'd seen an actual UFO. But it interested me because this was on the evening news, and UFOs didn't often make the news back in 1986. And it interested me enough to ask my brother Mark, my older brother, what he had seen. And this time I was ready to listen, and he described a pretty incredible sighting. He had two friends with him. They chased a UFO down Reseda Boulevard here in Southern California. And he described it as a metallic object, treetop level, right in front of his car. Had a dome on top, colored lights. And he had two witnesses with him. He's like, if you don't believe me, ask them. I knew who they were, his friends, Phil and Greg. And so I'm like, okay, I'll talk to them. And they described the same thing. That got me asking other people within my family. I found out my sister-in-law had seen UFOs. I had a couple of 3 or 4 friends who had seen UFOs. One had missing time. Every single one of these people had witnesses with them. So I'm like, I kind of assumed people were alone when they saw UFOs. I brought it up at the office where I worked, and people I'd worked with for years said, oh, yeah, I've seen them. I remember what really hit me hard is when Dorothy walked in. She's really outgoing. She's like, UFOs? Oh, yeah, one followed us home from the library. Me, my sister, and my mom. She says, Preston, it's really strange. It followed our car. We lived 5 minutes from the library. I know we left at 9 o'clock. And we got home, and this object darted off, and we looked at the clock. It was 10:15. I have no idea where the time went. There's like an hour missing there. There's hour, 10 minutes. There's no way. She had no idea what missing time meant. This was, Bud Hopkins' book had really just come out.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't a bestseller yet. It was later picked up by a major publisher, but it was first published by Richard Merrick Publishers, a small publisher. And I had found the book, which was a hardback. It was quite rare at the time. And I had read it, of course. And I'm like, wow, like, Dorothy, you may have been on board a UFO. She's like, what do you mean? I'm like, that's missing time. Don't you know what missing time means? And she said, no, what do you mean? And I ended up talking to her mother and her friend, Carol. And that's when I kind of knew there was something going on here. It was in my family. My other sister-in-law turned out had encounters as a little girl with blue type beings. Later, both my nephews would have close-up sightings. So yeah, it literally hit home, and I was not a happy camper. I was scandalized. I was pretty upset.
Well, and at some point you decided to do something about it. I mean, and I'm assuming that based upon what you've done in all these books that you've written is, first of all, you want to tell everybody what's going on, right?
Yeah. It was a really difficult adjustment for me. I think part of the reason I started writing these books is because I don't want anyone to have to go through what I went through. It really was a difficult thing for me to wrap my head around. And I came into this field somewhat naive. I had no idea that, this subject had been studied seriously for many decades, really. That there were very high level witnesses, very credible witnesses. There was mountains of evidence. There was good evidence of a cover up. It was really shocking. I bought all the books I could find. That was kind of my first step. I'm gonna disprove this, and I couldn't. So I'm like, I wonder if there's organizations out there. And I found MUFON right away. I'm like, wow. I joined MUFON, started attending their meetings, and I'm like, oh, look at you can become a field investigator. So I took their test. I applied for that, and they said, okay, yeah, you can take the test. This was probably 2 or 3 years into it. And they said, it's a take-home test. I'm like, oh, great. That'll be easy, is what I thought. This was before the internet, by the way. So I got the test, and it was not easy. It was not easy at all. I breezed through the UFO history section because by that point I had bought all the books. I bought every back issue of MUFON too. I didn't just subscribe. I'm like, give me all of it, because I was obsessed. So
now at Preston, at some point, you're interested in the academia. You're studying astronomy, physics, and all these things. And at some point, I've experienced this myself. Those two worlds sort of rub up against each other. And so, did you discuss this in the circles that you were, palling around in academia circles, and if so, did you meet with any kind of resistance, and did you feel like you had to go somewhere else because of it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I met resistance, and I got a lot of eye rolling and sniggers and like, oh, come on. And it divided my family. Really, my father was upset. He's like, stop talking about UFOs. 2 of my brothers were like, Preston has gone off the deep end. My sisters were okay with it. Somehow they kind of always thought that there was life out there. But yeah, I would clear rooms at a party pretty quick. And I had some friends who had a real hard time with it for years. Eventually, I think most of them came around.
So it was this experience with your brother, but have you had any experiences?
Yes, I did actually. Took a while. I really wanted to see stuff for myself, because reading books was all well and good, and talking to people. I started interviewing people. I'd ask anyone I met, have you seen a UFO? Can I interview you? is it okay if I record this? Can I come over? Was there anyone else? And so I was really, and then if someone said, oh, I saw a UFO last night, I'm like, I'm coming over, and I'm like, can I camp out in your yard? I did. Seriously, I wanted to see one. And ironically, my first sighting was not me really searching for it. I feel like they targeted me. I don't know if these UFOs know when someone starts investigating them, but possibly, because I had stayed up late at night talking to my brother, the one who'd seen a UFO, Mark, and my sister-in-law, his wife, Christine. And this was 1992. So this is 4 or 5 years into when I really buckled down. Because the first year I was kind of resistant to investigate. So I really started investigating in 88. I think that's when I joined MUFON and all the other groups, by the way. So at any rate, I'm like, it's getting late. We've been talking about UFOs all night. Thanks for helping me out, but I got to work tomorrow. And I'm driving home through Woodland Hills. This is a very dense suburb. And this is late July, about July 20th, 1992. And I'm coming down this corner on this tiny little side street at about 3 miles an hour, because it's a hairpin corner. You can't go faster than that. And I saw what I thought was a bird swooping towards my car. So I look up, it's, a couple hundred feet up to my right, and I can see instantly it's not a bird, it's glowing. I thought, well, that's a firecracker. And it clearly wasn't, because it was coming from my car. And it was an orb, actually, about the size of a golf ball, maybe. A little bit bigger, not quite as big as a tennis ball, but thereabouts. And this thing swoops down in kind of a parabola and stops right in front of my windshield, or maybe a foot, maybe 2 at the most, really about as far as I am from my computer. And just a soft white yellow orb. It had hard edges, and it's hovering over the hood of my car. I mean, this is how close it is. And it moves back and forth 2 or 3 times, stops in front of me again, goes forward, dips down, almost touches the road, and goes straight up. And I bend forward and I look up. I'm like, oh my! And I watch it dart out through the canopy of trees and straight out into outer space, I guess. And here's where it gets weird. For years, I would tell people, yeah, that was my sighting, and I honestly forgot about it. I strangely completely forgot. I don't remember. I should have turned around and said, Mark, Christy, you're not going to believe it. Something happened. I didn't do that. And I don't know what I did. And someone asked me, like, what happened next? I'm like, I don't remember driving home. I did not remember that sighting for months, until one day it just popped back into my head. So now I'm wondering, could I have had missing time? I think I did, because by then I'd interviewed a lot of people, 30, 40. And I'd talked to people who'd said, oh yeah, UFO hovered over a car, and that's the last we remember. We didn't talk about it. We didn't even remember it for a couple of years. I'm like, what do you mean you forgot about it? How is that even possible? I'm like, I don't know. Well, now I know, because it happened to me. And that was the first one of what would end up being about 10 to date. I've been in this field 35 years, but I've had about 10 really good sightings, mostly anomalous lights, I will say, but some much closer.
Well, so you've had, this is amazing to me. I've been chasing these things my whole life, and I've never really seen what I consider to be a true UFO. Although I was like, Stanton Friedman. I don't need to see one to know the phenomenon is real. Although he was lucky that he was able to see one later in his life, to my understanding. So I guess. Do you feel like there was something about you, and were these encounters more than just just sightings? Do you feel that you just mentioned that you might have had some missing time? Do you recall now later anything that might have happened during that period of time?
What happened during that missing time? I really don't. I was having a lot of dreams about UFOs. I was dreaming I was seeing grays. So that was strange. I don't know. I was obsessed. I don't think I was your average sort of UFO researcher. This is something I was really living and breathing and eating. And I mean, I was neck deep in it. So maybe that has something to do with it. First thing I did when I found out UFOs were real and, about missing time and stuff was examining my past, because I had never seen a UFO before. I don't see anything in my past that would point towards, me having any unusual experiences. Not really. I don't know. There could be a couple of incidents. There was one incident where I somehow missed lunch as a little kid, and I just knew it couldn't have happened, and I was really upset. So I wonder about that. Little tiny clues, but nothing I can really pin down.
Yeah.
But when I started having more, 1992 was a huge year for me. I ended up having 4 or 5 sightings that year, one after another. Boom, 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 boom. So that sort of knocked me over.
Yeah, that's amazing to me, because when I am fascinated by people who just have 1 or 2 sightings. I love to hear their stories, but when people have, and this is just my opinion, but when people have a number of sightings over a period of time, it almost, I don't want to say that this is the case, but it almost indicates that there is something about that person that they have some sort of a connection with these encounters. There's something about them that these visitors, or whoever they are, something about them that they're interested in.
Yeah, I wonder about that. And I will say I was out there like looking up and mentally calling them. I'm like, are you out there? So maybe that does have something to do with it. And it is in my family. Both my sister-in-laws have had encounters with, face-to-face encounters with ETs. I described my sister-in-law's encounter with grays, but my other sister-in-law finally came forward and told me, yeah, when she was a little girl around, I think it was 12, over a period of 2 weeks, she had repeated visitations with what she described as short, blue-skinned, sort of flat-faced figures. And she's also an artist. She drew a picture of them, which I've since shown to other people. And they're always shocked, like, oh my God, that's exactly what I saw. These short blue-skinned beings, which are, I won't say as common as grays, certainly, but I've heard a number of people describe them.
I think Whitley Strieber described beings with blue skin in his book Communion, to my recollection.
Yep, that's right. Yeah, it's always amazing.
So when did you write your first book? This is, I mean, clearly this is where this was all leading. You started writing, and you wrote your first book, Aliens and UFOs. And so why did you write that book?
Actually, I was in this field for about 10 years before I wrote my first book, and had written about 30 articles. And it was my sister-in-law. I was like, you should consider writing some books. You've got a bunch of cases. You could write about all the first cases of people you've interviewed. I'm like, huh. At the time, there was a huge wave of sightings going on over my hometown. I had just moved out, but people were.
What was your hometown?
Topanga Canyon.
Okay.
I'm originally from Chicago, but I pretty much grew up in Topanga Canyon, which is along the coast, right next to LA. Santa Monica, Malibu, that area. Mm-hmm. And in 1992 to 1994, there was a wave of sightings in which the police were receiving many calls. And so was the local newspaper. I had written an article for the local newspaper. And so they called me up and asked me to investigate. I ended up giving the police my phone number. So I had really documented this amazing wave of sightings. And my sister-in-law said that would make a great book. And at the same time, I had just talked to this lady who was having incredible encounters. She was probably the most extensive contactee, abductee I'd interviewed up to that time, because she described a lifetime of encounters, starting when she was a little girl all the way up to the present, and described really the whole gamut of phenomena. It wasn't just sightings, but she was having face-to-face encounters, bedroom visitations, missing time, onboard encounters. She described hybrid babies and all of this sort of thing. And she described that she had an incident where she had a cyst in her fallopian tubes and was scheduled to have surgery. It was verified on MRI, causing her a lot of pain and a lot of problems. And the night before surgery, she had a visitation, and she remembered them coming to her room, and that's about it, grays. And went to the doctor the next day, and the doctor accused her of having surgery because they could not find her cyst. And I'll call her Wendy. Wendy said, "No, I didn't." And they said, "Well, we know you did, because there's fluid that's present in your fallopian tube, which is only present if a person has had surgery. And what are these laser scars on your abdomen here?" And she played dumb. She kind of knew what was happening at this point. And I'm like, wow, because at that point I had heard of some healing cases in the literature. Jacques Vallée described a case. Ralph and Judy Bloom, Brad Steiger, a number of researchers had touched upon this.
Yeah, I'm personally familiar with at least one person that's experienced that.
Yeah, it's actually more common than you might think, because I thought, well, this would make a good article. And I thought, let's see, because I knew about the doctor in France was healed of a wound on his foot and paralysis, or a couple of police officers in Damon, Texas, one who was healed of a flesh wound on his hand, or a Peruvian customs official who was struck by a beam of light and healed of rheumatism and also nearsightedness. So these were some really famous cases in the literature. I thought, well, let's dig in a little deeper. And I found over 30, 40 cases. I thought, wow, that's way too much for an article. So I dug in deeper, and I ended up finding about 100 cases. So that became my first book, UFO Healings.
All right. So would you interpret these UFO healings as being an after effect of the encounter with UFOs, or is this something that the occupants, if you will, of the craft, so to speak, are purposefully doing? They're actually purposefully healing people of their ailments. I mean, clearly this isn't happening every time somebody has an encounter, but during some of these encounters, this happens, right?
Yeah. As you, I'm sure, know, physiological effects as a result of an encounter are fairly rare, especially when you consider the huge number of sightings. But I would say that, this is not, in most cases, what I would describe as an accidental after effect, because many of these people are being deliberately struck by a beam of light. I'm assuming it's deliberate because the beam of light is coming for them and it hits them.
Right.
I remember there was a case by Leonard Stringfield, a very well-known and pioneering researcher.
Mm-hmm. The crash and retrieval syndrome.
Right. Yeah. He described a case in Kentucky involving a 12-year-old boy by the name of Chuck Doyle, who saw a UFO from his backyard. It was hovering over the neighbor's yard, actually, and it sent down a beam of light, which kind of played across the field and hit him. And it healed him of a head cold, of all things. I thought, wow, this is odd. Is that intentional? I don't know. I mean, we can only speculate.
I remember hearing Travis Walton talk a few years ago about his encounter and going back to the site and finding extra thick growth rings from the time of the sighting, but also, and also a thicker growth of the trees in the area towards the direction of the sighting. But he himself also said that he has been unusually healthy. And maybe that's not necessarily the result of his encounter, but he hasn't really had a lot of health issues, at least at the time that he said that some years ago. I'm not certain if that's still the case, but he seemed to indicate that he really hadn't had any health issues over the years.
Yeah, I have to tell you, that is something I hear from contactees quite often. Not everyone. Some have had their health suffer, gynecological problems or eye problems.
I think of Jim Peniston and John Burroughs. They had some pretty hefty physiological effects, I think, from their close encounter.
Yeah. The case in another one, I think it was in Kentucky, with Mona Stafford, Louise Smith, and Elaine Thomas. But there were so many of these healing cases. I'm like, wow. And some are absolutely intentional. I mean, people are pulled on board and basically operated on.
Right. It's amazing, and it seems like there's and you tell me if I'm incorrect about this, but one of the conclusions that I've reached over the years is that we're likely the object of interest of many different civilizations, cultures, if you will, on many different levels of technology from many different places, all with different agendas.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. Because what we do see is a wide variation of descriptions of these humanoids. It's almost always humanoids, I will say that. And by and large, most of the reports I get personally, and I think this is borne out by other researchers, is grays. I would say almost 50%, if not more. But,
do you find that that's the case globally, or are grays more common in Western and European countries? Do you have any knowledge of that?
Yeah, I would say that that's true. I can't say I've statistically done the research to prove that. But yeah, that does seem to be the case, because you do get a lot more cases of human-looking ETs across Europe and perhaps short humanoids in South America. I don't know. It's really quite bizarre trying to categorize all this, because there's like 5 main types, I would say. Grays, you have short grays, you have tall grays, and of course human-looking, or essentially human. Praying mantis, which is odd to me. Like, why praying mantis? Why not bumblebees or ladybugs or dogs, for that matter? But those, I think, would be the 3 main types. Strange humanoids, really, of sort of a catch-all category.
Well, this interest that you've had in UFOs, now that morphed, right? Because you, in your books, you started to branch off into other areas of what you might call the paranormal. And although I've never seen a UFO, I did have a what I would call a paranormal encounter when I was about 7 years old, and that's part of what led me to become interested in UFOs. So it sounds to me like your interest in UFOs led you to become interested in other areas of what you might call the paranormal.
Yeah, and again, somewhat involuntarily, but it became clear that this was something I had to look into, because there was a connection there. A lot of the people who were having these encounters described perhaps a near-death experience or haunting activity in their home, what they perceived as haunting activity. I remember I had a case involving a gentleman who had a UFO land in his backyard in Canyon Country. And he said, "That's not the end of my story." I'm like, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, I had a Bigfoot encounter the next day." I'm like, "A Bigfoot? No." don't tell me that. He's like, no, I did. And that's not the only case I've gotten where there's that connection,
I know
which
that
is,
sounds crazy, but there is a connection there. I've had cases here in my own state that there does seem to be some kind of a connection between Bigfoot, if you will, and UFOs.
yeah, it's super rare. I will say that. And I haven't got dragged into Bigfoot studies.
Right?
Most people who see Bigfoot aren't going to see a UFO, and most people who have an encounter aren't going to see Bigfoot. But there's a cluster of cases where these two phenomena intersect perfectly. And so I started looking into the paranormal because I wanted to solve this mystery. There are a number of researchers who feel like this is not necessarily always extraterrestrial, that this is a phenomena that might be explained in ways that we, might not understand, or could be have another explanation, an intelligence that wears different masks. This is a theory brought up by John Keel, perhaps Lauren Coleman, Jacques Vallée. Um,
I agree. I agree with that. I think that we make a lot of assumptions when we just simply put these things into the box of little guys getting into a little spaceship that comes from Zeta Reticuli and flies across the galaxy and lands here, and they get out and they abduct us. That's a really good, easy story. But you and I both know that it's much more complex than that.
Yeah. I mean, I was investigating a haunting case, and it was just your typical sort of horrific haunting that was very active, lots of witnesses. This was a haunted apartment in Van Nuys. I ended up, the neighbors were having problems. I called up the building manager. She's like, thank God you called, because everyone in this building was having problems. And the people I interviewed who were in this haunted apartment moved out. And shortly after they moved out, had a very low level UFO sighting. There was clearly a connection there. And I don't know what to make of it, honestly. But it became clear to me that if I want to solve any mysteries, I'm going to have to look into ghosts. So I did. I looked into out-of-body experiences and Bigfoot and multiple personalities and demonology and all of it. I'm of the opinion we are dealing in most cases with extraterrestrials in the classic sense. I think it's the best theory, which really explains the totality of the evidence. And I would point in specifically towards the crash retrieval reports.
Mm-hmm.
Which
what an interesting series of documents. Well, at least I'm thinking, of course, of Leonard Stringfield and his series of reports on the crash and retrieval syndrome. And having obtained those when they first came out and read them, I was absolutely fascinated by because they're detailed drawings of the beings, purportedly done by the surgeons and so forth.
Right. Yeah. It wasn't just Leonard Stringfield. Ray Fowler was also doing some of this, and several major researchers had hints of these types of cases. And of course, Stanton Friedman broke the Roswell story, which had been simmering for years. Mm-hmm. So if those reports are true, and I know today they're pretty much anecdotal, we don't have access to hardware or bodies in the public arena to say that this is actually happening. But I think we have enough whistleblower accounts, because they number, I think it's in the thousands now, of reports of this, to say that there's probably validity to them. And if that's true, well, all bets are off. We know what this is. If there are ships and bodies, if people are getting radiation burns, if people are actually getting implanted, and I think we've got some really good smoking evidence there, smoking gun evidence. I think it's fair to conclude that some, if not most, of these cases of what people are reporting are extraterrestrials in the classic sense. I'm not going to say all, because some of these cases are beyond bizarre and have really difficult paranormal elements and just symbolic elements and parts of it that are just very hard to explain as extraterrestrial. So I'm going to leave that door open for some of these cases, but some are clear. I think, I mean, if it looks like a duck, it walks like a duck, it's quacking, there's so much smoke. Where there's smoke, there's fire.
I'm thinking in particular of the work of Dr. Roger Lear, right? And the alleged alien implants that he was removing from folks. At MUFON, we call those anomalous foreign objects. When we developed the protocol for removing and studying those objects, we sort of reached the conclusion that you really couldn't call them alien implants because someone would have to come and say, that's my implant. They'd have to be an alien and say, hey, give me that back.
Right.
So we decided to settle on anomalous foreign objects rather than alien implants, but ultimately, isn't that what they are?
Yeah, well, we think. I mean, the whole UFO field is suffering from truly horrific semantic disaster. Because here we have, the term UFO, which could mean anything, but really has come to mean extraterrestrial craft. And like, what do you call someone who's, experiencing being taken on board? We call them contactees, but that whole 1950 contactee era sort of made that perhaps not as accurate as some people would like. So they're called them abductees. And people are like, well, no, I wasn't abducted. I thought it was fine. I was invited on board. I'm like, okay, experiencer, which again is like, not the best term. So yeah, we're struggling with I will tell you, as far as anomalous objects in people's bodies, foreign bodies, that turns up quite a bit. It's shocking how often
it is amazing, isn't it?
They'll go to the dentist or the doctor. I would say that's probably more the rule than the exception if a person is having repeated onboard encounters. At some point, they go to the doctor and they're like, well, when did you get surgery? What is this in your foot? What is this? Just recently, in my latest book, I covered a case which was really astounding, of a lady who went to the dentist, took her son to the dentist, and the dentist freaked out because there was this object present on the x-ray, which she actually sent to me, and it shows what looks like, it's bigger than a BB. It looks more like a marble, and it's directly under his back upper molar. And I sent it with her permission, to an emergency physician and a general doctor, and both diagnosed it as a foreign body, metallic. Both asked if the son had shot himself in the mouth with a BB gun, and which of course they deny. Said no. And if you look at that, it's larger than a BB. There's no entry wound. It's asymptomatic. And initially, this boy denied any history of UFO encounters, but turned out that he was lying to his mom. Because I kept asking her, I'm like, she said, no, he's never seen a UFO. I'm like, well, ask him again. And he says, yeah, I did. I didn't want to tell you. I didn't want to scare you. But yeah, right before all this happened, it was just literally weeks before they had gone to the dentist, he had a very close encounter right outside their home. This is in Indiana.
Do you recall the details of that encounter?
Yeah. He saw what appeared to be a cluster of white lights. He was walking with his friend, and as they were looking at it, trying to figure out what it was, these lights dropped down to just a few hundred feet overhead and sort of turned into colored lights, which started flashing very brightly at them. And they felt that they were specifically targeted, if you will, because it came right over their head and stopped, and scared them a little bit because they felt like it was watching them and it was after them. And he can't specifically say he had missing time or anything like that, but further inquiries revealed that he was having very vivid dreams about what he called Nordic, which is a fairly common term in this field. I don't really like it. I'm not sure it's completely accurate. I prefer to call them human-looking ETs or figures.
They're just good-looking blonde people.
Yeah, but not always blonde.
Right.
That's kind of the point. I mean, I've talked to people who've described them as looking Middle Eastern or Mesoamerican. So I'd say that there are different ancestries going on there, but human looking. And he was quite obsessed with that type of what we would term ET. And later on, this was an ongoing case. It's really kind of rare to catch a case while it's unfolding, because often people will, shelve this and not talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And you're put in a position of investigating something years after the fact.
Right.
And she called me up one day. She says, the Greys came last night. They came last night. And so that was really amazing to watch this case unfold in real time.
Was the implant ever removed, or the
No.
object?
No, it's still there. The son has no interest in having it removed. He actually did have his wisdom teeth removed, and the oral surgeon offered to do it, and the child declined. He's quite nervous about it. Feels like it's there for a reason. And I tend to agree. I did interview someone who had their implant removed by Dr. Roger Lear. She had an encounter on Coronado Island. This was a multi-witness encounter. It's a really well-known case. It occurred in 1994. And she had the scar on her knee. She ended up going to Dr. Roger Lear and got x-rays, and there was an object there. She had it removed. And she says it was 2 weeks later, she had another experience, and she believes she was reimplanted. And and I've heard this before.
That if the objects are removed, they're simply replaced.
Yes. I know I was interviewing a gentleman from the Ozarks up in, I think it was Missouri area. And he had an object which he sneezed out of his nasal passages, and had an experience following that where he was presumably reimplanted. Another case of a lady in Florida, another of a housewife in Nebraska. So,
are you familiar with the phenomenon associated with these objects wherein they appear to exhibit or emit radio frequencies? Have you seen that?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that was part of the research of Dr. Lear, which was truly pioneering research. It's a shame he's passed away. I can't say I knew him well, but we have corresponded and spoken many times. And I know that there was a lot of unusual aspects to these implants.
Yeah, one of the things that fascinated me was I remember seeing something that was recorded with Dr. Lear, and he was attempting to get a hold of one of these implants, and it appeared on the x-ray to be actually physically moving away from the forceps that he was attempting to grab onto the object with, and so he would move the forceps, and it seemed to be purposefully avoiding the forceps.
Yeah. Some of them are magnetic. There's no foreign body reaction. A lot of them look almost identical, if not identical.
Well, that's the fascinating part to me, not the identical part, but the fact that they don't cause any immune response.
Yeah, which is very unusual. I mean, if this was shrapnel or something from a car accident or a fall, which is definitely something you have to consider, there would be sort of an immune response. The body would surround it with calcium. It would become infected. And we don't see that in these cases. And often there's no visible entry wound. So
fascinating.
It's very hard to understand what exactly is going on here.
Yeah.
But I will say, there's been a lot of speculation about what are they for? Are they for tracking? I interviewed, actually, this was the same lady who had a cyst mysteriously disappear following an encounter. She was taken on board. She has fully conscious encounters. I trust that hypnosis does work to recover memories accurately. There's quite some controversy about, the use of hypnosis. So I kind of shied away from it. I don't generally recommend it unless a person has clear-cut case missing time and anxieties and so forth. I think it does work. I think we've got evidence of that.
Yeah.
But
I suspect that these implants that we're talking about, that I would hope you agree with this, that it's probably much more than just monitoring where they're at and tracking them. It's probably these devices, considering if they are in fact, alien implants or implants put there by some advanced civilization, that they probably collect all kinds of data about the being they're implanted in. I mean, probably brain waves and, chemical makeup, maybe even read your thoughts.
Yeah, I think there's some evidence pointing towards that, actually, because the most single common experience a person has if they are taken on board is being physically examined. And the fact is, there are a lot of healing cases, and many of these are of, one of my later books is The Healing Power of UFOs. I put out a new edition because I've got 300 cases, 300 from virtually every major researcher out there. John Mack had many. Bud Hopkins never wrote about it, but I cornered him. He says, yes, I've got several. David Jacobs, of course, Barbara Lamb. I mean, I could go on. It's quite common. ETs seem to know a lot about the human body. And this lady that I interviewed, Wendy, who had a cyst removed, asked the ETs, because they were implanting her. She says, what are you doing? They said, we're putting in an implant. She said, what's the purpose of it? And it said, this is to monitor your vital signs. This is to monitor your health. And I had another case where a person was told it's to boost your immune system. And another was told it's to measure the levels of pollution in your body. And the more I looked into it, these were the kind of explanations that usually came forth, something along the lines of health monitoring.
It's probably all those things.
I would suspect it is. Yeah. And I'm not so sure it's tracking, because people have had these removed and the ETs still come right back.
No right where to find them.
Yep.
I want to hit you up with something. I'd like to get your take on this. My background's in genetics, molecular biology, and my take on this phenomenon, the abduction phenomenon following families, has to do with just that, genetics and environmental monitoring. And in my mind, if you were going to study the effects of the environment on a species, you would want to start many years ago, a long time ago, thousands, hundreds of thousands of years ago, millions of years ago, with a baseline, and then you monitor that baseline through the course of events, rather than just, I don't think you could just come here and look at the things living here and say, oh, I wonder what kind of effects the radiation they're pouring into the atmosphere has on them. You would not be able to do that. The only way you could do it is by starting off, as I said, sometime in the past, and then monitoring the effects on that particular genetic lineage, and perhaps many different genetic lineages over a long period of time, so that you can actually gauge the effects of the environment on the organism that you're studying. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah. And I started wondering, like, who's being, contacted and why? Because in my own files, it's evenly divided between men and women. And it comes from all over the world. And it's every different ancestry you can think of. Mm-hmm. And, it's not just Rh negative blood type. It's all different people. Well, even very young children to very elderly people. And I would say about half of the cases or more, 60 to 70%, fit that pattern, that this is something that does appear to be happening to their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, their children. But I've got many cases of what I would call a one-off too.
Travis
which is
Walton.
hard. Yeah, which perhaps are just in the right place at the right time. But I did notice another pattern, which was your job, your vocation. Because I started to see a lot of social workers. And I thought that was really odd. John Hunter Gray, John Salter was one of the first ones. He's like a social worker who had a very well-known encounter. And then I interviewed, Michael Carter. He's also a social worker. And I remember interviewing a lady from Norway. She was healed. I said, "What's your job?" She says, "Please don't use my name because I'm very well known in my country for human rights work and animal rights activism." And I started like, because I kept hearing that. I started looking at people's profession, and I found an awful lot of that. And a lot of doctors, a lot of teachers, artists, and inventors. And
I noticed that you're not saying that you're finding a lot of lawyers.
I did find a couple. I did, but by and large, these are really nice people who are very concerned with helping humanity. And I see it quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. It's a loose pattern. I remember I was interviewing this gentleman who had really profound encounters. I said, "What do you do for a living?" He said, "I'm a bus driver." I'm like, "Oh, okay. That's really interesting." And he had some really interesting bus driving stories. He says, "Well, I have to tell you my true passion is, running this website where I talk about spiritual information. I'm trying to, help people along the spiritual path towards enlightenment." I'm like, "Ooh, well, there's that pattern that's turning up again."
Yeah.
So, I came into this field thinking, well, this is horrific. This is bad news. People are being kidnapped against their will, subjected to experimentation by bug-like aliens with zero compassion. And I kind of come around towards the other direction. I flip-flop a little bit, but
because quite often the encounters really aren't voluntary, and you can interpret them as abductions, but at the same time, on as you're saying, the flip side of that is that the encounters are actually positive, and that there's more to it than just being kidnapped and I'm putting a tag on you. There's an exchange taking place.
Exactly. So I started looking like, why is this person calling this experience negative? Well, it's because they had nightmares and PTSD and don't feel like this was something that they chose or volunteered for. And it was very scary. I'm like, did you actually get hurt? No. Very few people. I found almost no accounts of what I would call overt sadism or torture or anything like that. The worst I usually hear is, this physical exam, which can be scary and sometimes painful. Mm-hmm. But people who don't have a...
Well, I think about Colonel Corso's story that he didn't really want getting out was that when they found the wreckage at Roswell, there were human body parts. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I'm not sure what to make of it because I've never heard any person describe that at all. And I know there is disinformation in this field. We know this.
Yeah, like the story that actually it was a Russian rocket gone awry, right, with small Russian children, orphans in the that were mistaken for aliens, right?
Yeah, and because there's body parts, you may assume automatically, well, that's negative. They're dismembering people. Well, what if they were growing body parts to heal people with? Because you really can't look through the lens of fear any more than that you can look through the lens of Space Brothers.
Right.
You have to be really objective about this.
Right. Now you've written 28 books, and your most recent book covers 25 encounters. What's the title of your book? Wondrous 25 True UFO Encounters. So tell us about that. Your latest book. What do you cover there?
I wanted to cover really a wide variety of cases because often my books are thematic. I did one on onboard UFO encounters, one on schoolyard encounters, one on about sightings over drive-in theaters of all places, one about USOs, and this one covers really everything. Some very close-up sightings, which are really interesting because they had telepathic communication. A couple of UFO landing cases, which are quite rare. several onboard encounters, of course, a really fascinating USO account, unidentified submersible object, some whistleblower accounts that I hadn't been able to find room for in my other books. And I really wanted to get those out. And I wanted cases that I think had something unique or to contribute, or something that would help contribute to our understanding of this phenomenon. Extensive cases that were credible, cases with physical evidence, multiple witness cases. The best, that because you interview a lot of people, and some cases are fairly cut and dry, and you've heard it a million times. But these are the more unusual and extensive cases.
Yeah. And if folks wanted to buy your book, your most recent book, and any of your books, how would they get a hold of them? How would they get them?
Amazon, of course, is our online retailers, bookstores near you. I also do have a website. So if you want to check out like excerpts, or if you want to get a hold of me, people can contact me through my website.
What's your website?
I think if you just use the search engine on my name, it will take you there, but it's PrestonDennett.weebly.com. And I'm putting out a YouTube channel. I'm putting out my research because, these days people don't want to read any more than 15 minutes. They want their information. They want it now. So,
and they want it in a short period of time.
Yes, which I haven't been able to do some of these. Because I like diving deep into the evidence. It's just kind of my nature. I really want to, look under every rock, look at it from every angle.
Yeah. And after all this time, Preston, what sort of conclusions have you reached about this phenomenon and its relationship to our species? I know that's a broad question, but you must have reached some sort of, at least at this stage, you must have some sort of opinion about what it all means. Yeah,
I do. I think one solid conclusion is they've been around for thousands of years. I think the evidence really speaks towards that. I don't really buy into the alien threat narrative because I think if that were true, these guys are so advanced, which is about the only thing people really agree on. They could take over easily, and they haven't. I think we've got a pretty good handle on their agenda as well. Yes, they're very interested in people physically, but also mentally and emotionally and spiritually. And they're collecting animals and plants. So they're very much science-based. I think these ETs are. And often, I think another major agenda is to warn people. If there's any communication at all beyond, don't be afraid, we won't hurt you, which is by and large the message people get, which is positive for sure. The other message would be warnings of nuclear proliferation, of environmental destruction, of pollution, of our warlike ways, which again is positive. And often, and this is not unusual if a person is taken on board, they're taken to the engine room, shown how the craft is powered, almost always along electromagnetic or magnetic lines. And also not unusual is to be taken to the control room or the helm. And even, sat down in the seat and taught how to fly the craft. That happens quite a bit. And the more I really objectively sort of stepped back and looked into this, I'm like, wow, these guys, I don't think they're here to take over. I really don't. I think we are moving towards open official contact. I think that's one of the cutting edges of UFO research, which would be CE5 or calling down UFOs. The whole disclosure movement is rapidly gaining steam.
Well, and that's something else I guess we can talk about. I'd like to just get your take on what's happened lately, because you have the director of NASA saying that these objects that they've been looking at could possibly be extraterrestrial. What do you think about that, Preston? And also the director of national intelligence, just 3 weeks later, saying the same thing. This is just a couple of weeks ago. That, well, and also folks high up making these statements that they have high confidence that these objects are not being manufactured by the Russians or the Chinese. Why is all this stuff happening right now?
Yeah, I'm really pleased because I haven't been in this field for 35 years. There was zero movement, really at all, from any official body out there. And now we've got senators and representatives and presidents and all kinds of high-level military people talking about this, like the Pentagon saying, we have material from otherworldly vehicles. I think this is something that they are being forced into, honestly. I am not sure they're doing it completely voluntarily.
Wouldn't you agree that, and this is sort of my take on it, that if the ETs, if that's what they are, or who they are, if they really wanted us to know that they were here, they would do that. They wouldn't care what our government said. They would just come down and, as I guess, make the proverbial landing on the White House lawn, or land all over. But that's clearly not the case. And so, wouldn't it be correct then that it's actually they who are controlling the secrecy? It's them who are saying, it's they who are saying, not yet.
Yeah. Well, as Jacques Vallée said, it's a triple cover up. It's the government, it's the ETs, and it's people themselves who are often largely silent. And now we have a lot of people coming forward, and that is really broken through to the mainstream. And we have ETs definitely stepping up their game in terms of what I would call publicity or displays, outright displays like the Phoenix Lights or Hudson Valley Wave or the Belgium Wave or the Mexico City Wave or Gulf Breeze, Withville, Virginia, Topanga Canyon. I mean, I can go on. These happen every 5 or 10 years. And I think the schoolyard encounters, I've got 100 cases where they hover over schools during the day at low level, land in 30% of the cases.
Wow.
Frank Salisbury wrote the Utah UFO display. I think he was one of the first to use that term, display. UFO behavior is often evasive, but sometimes they clearly want to be seen. And they are conducting what amounts to a publicity campaign. I don't see how you can look at it any other way. It's very sort of controlled, certainly. I agree, they could end the cover-up right now. And they're not doing that. And I think that probably because, I hate to speculate in this field. It'll send you right down a rabbit hole.
Sure.
but I'm guessing, let's say that no, we're not quite ready for that. And maybe we are now, but we're a pretty warlike species. We're pretty prejudiced in our thinking, very fear-based in our thinking.
You want to know what I think about that? Can I tell you what I think about that? I think that fear and that sort of reptilian brain exists clearly in a lot of humans, but I think that the fear and the fear of the other, that's more common to a smaller number of people. When I look at the world and the people who control our planet, those are the people who like to control things, and most people don't like to do that. You know what I'm saying? I think people are inherently good, that we're decent as a species, and the bad people are the people that run the show because that's what they like to do.
Yeah, and I 100% agree. Most people are absolutely kind. And if you get to know them, they will give and share. We are all one. And I think there is an alien threat. The real alien threat is to those people who are trying to control others. Yeah. It's a threat to their position of power. And if everyone knew UFOs were real and we have other people out there, and I think it would collapse sort of a lot of the corruption and greed and the divisiveness that is going on in our society.
I completely agree with that. Yeah, Preston, it looks like we've reached the end of our time together, and I feel like we could probably talk all night.
Oh, I know I could talk for weeks on the subject. Don't get me started.
Well, hopefully I could have you on again one of these days, maybe when you get your next book out.
Yeah, yeah, very much like that. I'm interviewing a lady from Florida who's had fully conscious contact since age 14.
Oh my gosh.
And she has a story unlike any I've ever heard. I've heard it from bits and pieces from other people, but she has one continuous narrative that is really astounding. And I think she has a greater understanding of these visitors, as Whitley Strieber likes to call them, probably than anyone else I've ever heard. So I'm pretty excited about that.
Well, we will look forward to reading about that. I will look forward to reading about that. And again, I really appreciate you being here with us tonight, Preston. I really do. And I hope we get to talk again.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Thanks again for having me on. I appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks, Preston. I'll be back in just a few moments with some afterthoughts.
You are not alone. Thousands of people all over the world have sightings of UFOs per month. MUFON is the place to report them. Since 1969, MUFON has been investigating UFO reports and providing this information to the public. Our aim is the scientific study of UFOs for the benefit of humanity. Support UFO research. Join MUFON today.
You are listening to the official podcast of the Mutual UFO Network.
Our talk with Preston Dennett brings to mind the famous quote from Shakespeare's Hamlet. "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy." Preston has devoted a lifetime to exploring the hidden corners of reality and shed light on a wide range of hidden, sometimes forbidden subjects. The world we observe with our eyes and ears every day could be nothing more than a facade that covers a much deeper hidden world upon which only a few who dare are allowed to gaze. The interesting thing about paranormal matters is that they often become glaringly evident upon close examination. All it takes are a few brave souls like Preston Dennett who venture out into the darkness, put their boots on the ground, and dare to ask the big questions. Thank you again for joining us. If you're watching on YouTube, please remember to like and subscribe. And we'll see you next time right here on the official MUFON podcast.